So yeah, I'm going to be talking about permaculture in the home garden. So we're going to be going over, first of all, what permaculture is. Then I'm going to share 5 rules that you can follow to integrate permaculture in your own homestead or garden, or really in any aspect of your life. I'm going to share stories of each of those rules from my own homestead and farm, and actually from some of my design clients. And then we'll finish off with some Q&A. So yeah, make sure you guys are putting any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. And my goal for this presentation is that you guys are going to walk away with ideas for how to increase the nutrient density, the total yield, the variety, the resilience, and the growing season of your fruits and veg. You're going to come up with some ideas for how to decrease the labor and time that you're spending gardening. You're going to figure out how to find the best spot on your homestead for your garden. One of the biggest mistakes I see homesteaders make is they put their garden in the wrong place, and then forevermore they're just struggling with everything else to deal with gardening, all the management that goes into it. So the location of your garden is really key. And in general, it's going to be about how to transform drudgery and waste into joy and abundance. So my motto is, with all these rules I'm going to share is, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, so there will be some tips and tricks. But what I really want to do is to teach you guys how to fish so you can feed yourselves for a lifetime. But beyond that, and this is what I think really separates permaculture from a lot of other, just gardening knowledge and know-how stuff, which is really important, is permaculture will teach you how to create more fish. And that's why I got so excited about it back in 2012 when I first discovered it. So a bit of background on my context. As Paul and Edwin were saying, I grew up on a 250-acre mixed organic farm in central Alberta, where we produce beef, pork, chicken, dairy, eggs, berries. We also grow livestock feed for other homesteaders, and we've got lots of personal gardens. I've never purchased carrots or potatoes or anything in my whole life. I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and my mom basically raised all of us from her gardens. We live in growing zone 3, which goes from -40 to +40 Celsius or 100 Fahrenheit. Our frost goes 8 feet in the ground, so all of our water lines have to be buried that far down, otherwise they'll freeze. We've got about 115 growing days that are above freezing. We get about 12 inches of rain or 12 inches of snow every year. So pretty much it's the most inhospitable climate imaginable. So if anything I'm going to share today, if it works for us, it's going to work for you. And our mission on our farm is to grow the most nutrient-dense food possible while regenerating the ecosystems that produced it. And of course, as Edwin mentioned, I did purchase a 33-acre homestead just 2 years ago, and I'll be sharing some stories from that. And then in addition to farming, the last few years, I've started a homesteading mentorship business with 2 of my best friends, and our goal is to help work one-on-one with folks all over the world to help them buy, design, develop, and manage land. So I'll be sharing some of the stories from some of our clients we've worked with. So first off, what is permaculture? Well, it was created in the 1970s by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, and there's no better way to learn about it than to hear it from the horse's mouth. So Bill said that it was the core permaculture design. So the core permaculture is design and the working relationships and connections between all things. And David described it as it was consciously designed landscapes which mimic the patterns and relationships found in nature, while yielding an abundance of food, fiber, and energy for provision of local needs. So it's not just gardening. Permaculture is a portmanteau of permanent and culture. So it's about everything. It's about, yes, gardens and agriculture, but it's also about building design. It's about how to create effective water systems, even legal and government systems. It's a really comprehensive system. But if you were to describe it in a single word, it would be this: biomimicry, which is to comprehend and copy nature to accomplish human flourishing in ways that are better, faster, or cheaper. So the idea is nature has run billions of years of R&D to figure out what works. So it only makes sense for us to copy genius rather than reinvent mediocrity. And so you can see here this picture of our farm on the left and a typical industrial farm on the right, you can see which one of these is mimicking nature versus which one is destroying it. Okay, diving into these 5 rules now. The first one that we're going to cover is synergy, which is every need and yield of every element is provided by and put to productive use in the system. So when we talk about elements, these are the plants, animals, and structures on your homestead. And you can think about this as, so the definition of synergy is the interaction of 2 or more elements to produce a combined effect greater than the sum of their parts. So think of this as like a web of life, or an ecosystem web where you've got all these different relationships. And that's the same thing that we're trying to do on our farms and homesteads, is that it's not about the individual elements. It's about the connections between them. It's about this web of functional relationships. So one of the basic examples or exercises, and I encourage everyone to do this for your own garden and for every other element that you have, is something called a needs and yields analysis. So what you want to do is, again, take out every single element. So all your different plants, animals, structures, and figure out what do they need and what do they provide to the system? What are their inputs? What are their outputs? So if you take a look at a garden needs seeds, needs fertility or mulch, needs water management, pollination, protection from wind or wildlife, and it needs dappled sunlight, this is a key thing that I've only learned recently, is that while most of your vegetables will say full sun, plants actually only optimally photosynthesize around room temperature. So 70 Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. And if it's much cooler or warmer than that, their efficiency actually drops a lot. So having that dappled sunlight is really key. And we're going to get into that here in a minute. And of course, what a garden's yield is, they yield food, biomass, more seeds if they're managed properly, nectar for pollinating insects, shade if you can, certain tall plants, you can use it for that, and of course beauty. And the idea is how do we create these relationships by bringing in other elements where any of the needs of these elements are provided by other elements in the system, and the yields are put to productive use. So let's do a deep dive on one of these needs of the garden, which is fertility and mulch. So in a standard kind of industrial garden setting, you would just buy fertilizer for the fertility needs. So you have gardens plus fertility or fertilizer, and you'd get vegetables. But in a permaculture system, rather than just buying an input, you want to create a relationship. So you might bring in chickens, you might feed those chickens. The chickens will produce manure, which is one of their yields, and then that yield can be connected with your garden, which will provide fertilizer, which will get you veggies. But in addition to that fertilizer, you're also going to get eggs, work, heat, meat, more chickens, and fun. So for example, like a chicken will eat 1/3 of a pound of feed per day, which in most places in the world costs about 30 cents if you're buying organic feed. But that chicken is also going to produce 1/3 of a pound of fertilizer, which again, in most places of the world is about 30 cents worth of value. So that right there is a wash. You've got 30 cents in, 30 cents back in terms of value. But in addition to that, they're also going to produce, a chicken will lay pretty much an egg a day, or about 300 eggs a year. So you're going to get 1 egg a day, which again, in most places in the world, they're about $1 an egg. Again, you can change these values. In Canada here, our dollar is about 50 cents in the dollar for the States, but the ratio will still work out. So that right there is a 3x return on energy invested. Again, this is the whole concept here, is about synergy, where the sum is greater than its parts. But in addition to that, you're also going to get an animal that will eat the weed seeds, the waste and kitchen scraps from your garden kitchen. So 1/3 of that 1/3 of a pound of feed a day could come from garden scraps. There's a general rule of thumb is you want to have 1/3 greens, 1/3 grubs, and 1/3 grains for your chickens. So 1/3 of that food could be just waste products from the garden itself, right? So you're going to start to get these interactions. But those chickens could also eat bugs. Like for example, there's studies that have shown chickens can eat 300 ticks in an hour, a single chicken. They're also going to produce about 20 BTUs of heat per bird. Maybe that could be used to heat a greenhouse. They can level about or mix up about 50 pounds of compost or mulch a day. Again, I'm going to share a story about how I use that on my farm later. And then after laying, 300 eggs for the first year, their production starts to go down. So maybe they could be harvested for meat, which you could turn into, sausage or soups, which could, easily feed a person for probably a week. And then the entrails and feathers can be composted. So you're going to even create more fertility. And that whole time, you're going to be provided with endless enjoyment of, just watching these incredibly fascinating creatures just run around and get into all kinds of trouble. It's just a ton of fun. So that right there is a really great example of how 1 + 1 equals far more than 2. We've got 10 functions there. 1 chicken plus 1 garden equals 10 functions. So this is a great example of, again, those synergetic systems where the sum is greater than its parts. So now to take this out of theory and put it into practice, I want to share a story about the new homestead that I just purchased 2 years ago. So these are, some of the pictures off the realtor site when I first bought it. Again, it was 33 acres. And I want you to notice how, thick these trees are. This is an old shelter belt that was planted right next to the house. You can notice where the previous owner was parking his vehicle. And also notice just how kind of disconnected everything is. This was actually a farmyard that had been a functional farm for about 100 years. And it had since, been sold off and it was just being used for grain farming. But you can see just how, the barns and the outbuildings, everything's kind of spread out. So for the first year, I spent observing and redesigning everything with my team. And you can see, these designs. Before we even get into any of these details, you can already start to see some of these synergistic effects, and it's very, very purposeful. So the first step for me to plant my garden on my homestead was I needed to open up that jungle that was around the south and west of my property. So I came in, cut down about 50% of the existing trees, and that mulched and organized all that biomass, kept the bigger trees for firewood, and the mulch was going to use for a future food forest. And the idea here is I wanted to, again, produce mulch, which is a need of my garden. I needed to let in more sunlight to get that dappled shade. You can start to see here, that they're letting a little bit of sunlight, but there's also some kind of a shade that's going to create a really nice sheltered environment. It's also going to protect me from wind. It also increases the beauty incredibly. I planted over 100 species of food forest plants for my own food, but also for pollinator habitat, for wind shelter, for future mulch, and also with fertility by planting nitrogen fixing trees that were in the future were going to help provide the fertility for my garden. And so at the end of that first year of doing a lot of cleanup, planting this food forest and planting a lot of food forest trees into this shelter belt here, I was finally ready to start putting in my garden, which was the best location, even though it used to be an old parking lot, was right here next to my house. So step one, I started by tilling up a 25 by 30 foot plot in the ideal location. This is right outside my kitchen window, right by my front door. I planted a multi-species cover crop that fall to start turning the dirt into soil. The next spring, I terminated that cover crop. I laid out 30-inch market garden beds because everything is, there's amazing tools, everything's standardized. I really encourage people to use 30-inch beds. Then I planted living mulch pathways in the 18-inch pathways in between. And just a few weeks later, you can already start to see some of those synergistic relationships, right? We've got my food forest, which is starting to grow here, is providing wind shelter, shade, pollination. I've got my chickens in a chicken tractor that are providing some of the fertility. And I've got a birdhouse here that's also attracting in birds for fertility and pest control. I've got these living mulch pathways that are going to provide mulch and build soil to help conserve water. A few weeks later, I'm already able to start cutting that cover crop in my pathways and applying it as mulch in my garden beds. And you can just see how, again, how these interactions are starting to come to play. Another really simple example of needs and yields is the classic three sisters, right? We've got corn, bean, and squash planted in this synergistic relationship where the corn provides a trellis for the beans fix nitrogen for the corn, and the squash covers the ground to reduce uh, water needs and to help build soil biology. So yeah, and I was applying a lot of these same concepts, but beyond just the three sisters, which I have in my corn here, I'm using the same idea in my 3 different rows where I've got some beans up a trellis with carrots planted on either side. I've got peas with parsnips on either side. This is a row of Brussels sprouts with bush beans on either side. And then I've got corn with squash or watermelons. And so you might think that, having things planted that densely would create competition, but it doesn't. It's actually collaboration if it's designed properly. And even though it was a parking lot, a few months before, the yields were really quite good. I was really pleased. This is some of the corn here. And I averaged about 2 to 3 ears per corn plant, which is pretty much the max that you can get. This garden fed me through the summer and, left me with, about 30, 40 pounds of carrots and potatoes each, lots of fermented vegetables in the root cellar, which again, not bad to go from a place where, the previous owner was parking his cars, this really thick jungle of mismatched plants to this beautiful ecosystem. And that's really what it's all about. Is another one of the biggest mistakes I see on homesteads and gardens as well, is that people have this diversity of monocultures. So they have lots of elements, they've got lots of plants and animals and structures, but there's no connections between them. And from that, we can, with this first rule, permaculture, we can start to turn that diversity of monoculture into this ecosystem of abundance through the use of designing functional relationships. So some garden tips here. If you want to apply some of these principles in your own garden, orient your rows north and south. That will allow for more optimal sunlight down your pathways so that as the sun's going around, it's not being shaded out by the other rows. Put your garden on a slope or a hill so it can drain frost naturally. Where I located my garden here, there's a bit of a slope down here. I can go out and it'll be, with the thermometer, I can measure, it'll be 5-6 degrees Celsius here, and just a few hundred feet away where the elevation is dropped, they'll be freezing in the low spots. So in a climate like mine, where we have such a short growing season, finding these microclimates is really key. In your annual pathways, you can use some kind of an annual grain like oats or barley or wheat or rye for the first year, and then orchard grass as a perennial crop in the pathways forevermore. You want to choose a bunch grass, not something that's going to sucker and eventually get into your beds. And orchard grass or coxfoot is another name for it, is a really great mix. I'd recommend going about maximum of 3 rows of plants per 30-inch bed. Again, I mentioned some of the ones that I used. Surround that whole thing with a food forest for fertility and biomass and all that good stuff. Integrate animals into there, chickens, wild birds, and make sure you put it in view of your kitchen or living room windows. And then have it right by your front door for easy management. So right there, you can see how just with thoughtful design, we've facilitated almost all of these needs, and all of the yields are also being cycled back into the system. So when you're trying to build your synergized homestead, here's what you do. You create a list of all your elements that you have or that you will have, and write down each of their needs and yields. And then you ask yourself, how can every need and yield of every element be provided by and put to productive use in the system by creating these synergistic relationships? And the idea here is that, work is a failure in design and pollution is an unused resource. So if any of the elements can't meet their own needs, we have to do work. And if any of the yields can't be put to productive use, it will create pollution. So if you find yourself on your homestead and you've got too much work, or you're finding pollution or waste anywhere, it's because you need to go back to this rule and create some synergistic relationships. All right, on to rule number 2 here. Is we want to create these adaptive systems. So every element has multiple functions, and every function is provided by multiple elements. And again, these elements are plants, animals, and structures. So the definition of adaptive is the ability to deal with different situations and or provide different uses. So there's 2 ways you can look at this rule. The first is, okay, what are all the essential functions on your homestead? So for most people, it's going to be food, water, wealth, energy, shelter, entertainment, health. And the goal is we want to make sure that for each one of these essential functions, and you may have more different ones, but you want to make sure that there's multiple ways that your homestead can provide each one of these. So, for example, for food, you don't want to just have a garden. You want to have a greenhouse, cold frames, a food forest, livestock. You want to be able to forage for wild plants and hunt wildlife. For water, you don't want to just rely on your well or city water. You want to have rain tanks, ponds. You want to find a way to utilize shade and mulch to minimize the amount of water that you have. One of my favorite rules of thumb with regards to water is shade is better than mulch, mulch is better than irrigation, and irrigation is better than drought. So what you really want to have is find a way to use shade and mulch to minimize how much water that you actually need to apply, and then figure out where you're going to get water from. So, and we want to go through each one of these essential functions and find, okay, what are there multiple ways that we're achieving each of these on our homestead? And then the second way that we look at this is, okay, now we've got our key functions covered. Now, does each element itself provide multiple functions? And Bill Mollison said that every element had to provide at least 3 functions, and which is a really great design exercise to get into. So here's an example of one of the multifunctional elements on my property. So this is a simple cold frame. I've got this right outside my back door. It's rough 2x6 perimeter that are elevated off the ground. This is not a raised bed. The soil in the bed is the same elevation as the mulch pathways on the outside. That's very purposeful because I want to create a gap in here so that when I close these lids, I can create a nice little microclimate in there. I've got polycarbonate lids. These are just waste polycarbonate that I found on hinges, so they're easy to open and close. It's positioned right by my back door, so it's easy to monitor. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to direct seed vegetables a month before my frost date, my last frost date, with 0 heat or 0 lights. If you're like me, I absolutely hate grow lights and potting things and having them in my house or all that finicky stuff. My goal is I want to do the 80-20 of gardening. What's the 20% of work that gets me 80% of the results? And so I find direct seeding things and finding ways to do that strategically that's where I like to garden. And so the previous garden that I showed from my kitchen garden, all those plants were direct seeded. I don't start anything. Now, but that means I've got a short growing window. So having these simple elements like this extends my growing season by a month on the front end and a month on the back end. And so once I get a little bit later into the season, I can take those lids off. I can put in some trellises, and these guys just click in very easily. I can install them with one hand in a matter of seconds. I actually have a YouTube video on this on my channel. If you just search my name, you can find it. So once those plants get big enough, take the lids off. They've got room to stretch out. And by the end of the season, I've got this beautiful jungle that is, all these plants, again, are providing for each other's needs and yields, but they're also providing multiple functions to me. One of them being, look at these beans here that are climbing up that trellis and shading these east-facing windows on my house, providing me privacy from a main road, but also cooling effects during the hot summers that we get here. Now, in the wintertime, I put the lids back on, and I can either plant a cover crop, which is what's shown in this image here, or you can actually plant, a fall garden and keep things growing further into the season. This picture was taken just a couple days ago. We just got through a bunch of -40 weather, and you can see here, this is a 3-foot soil penetrometer. I was able to push it into the ground, with one hand very easily. Part of that is because of the cold frame, but part of it also is because this is positioned right next to my house. Any heat loss from my basement, it's an old house, it's very leaky, that actually creates a nice warm microclimate around my house. So by putting this raised bed right up against my house, I'm able to make use of that yield or that waste product of my house and put it to productive use in these raised beds. So now I don't have frost in these garden beds. In the future, I'm going to be stacking even more functions into these simple cold frames. I'm going to put mushrooms in the mulch pathways. This is King Stropharia or wine cap gardens. You can buy the spores online. They grow very well. I've already got them in my food forest. I was able to harvest like 100 pounds of mushrooms last year. I'm also going to put what's known as a worm tower in the center of my raised bed, which is just a perforated pipe that you dump garden scraps into or vegetable scraps into, and it allows worms to get safely from the soil into that, decomposing material, and then spread the fertility all around. So this is like a really lazy man's compost pile that you put right in your garden bed. And again, because that soil doesn't freeze, even in my climate, these little critters are going to stay active the whole winter. And once my soil is built up a bit, I'm actually going to be able to grow year round. This is a fantastic book by a lady named Nikki Jabour. She grows in Zone 6 in Halifax, Canada. And she's found ways to not only keep plants growing right through the winter, but actually ways to keep things it's like a lazy man's cold room or a root cellar. So rather than having to dig these plants up and then store them in a root cellar to keep them, she can keep carrots and potatoes and other root vegetables in addition to, cold greens and stuff like that, at least alive or even growing right through our cold Canadian winters here. So again, these are some more ideas for how you can stack all these functions into a single element. So right here, it's a garden. It allows me to start my seeds without, potting plants and lights and heat mats. It's a root cellar that allows me to extend my season and actually store stuff in the ground. It's a worm tower to help me compost. I can grow mushrooms. It helps me extend my season. It provides shade, privacy, beauty, all out of one single element. So some cold frame tips here. Again, rough 2x6 sides, polycarbonate lid, use a cattle panel or hog panel as trellis up against the side of your house, or you can put 2 beds side by side and have one of those nice arches between the two. Mushrooms in the pathways, worm tower in the center, and of course, right outside your back door for easy management. I would recommend starting out with no more than 5 rows per 30-inch wide bed. This bed here was 30 inches wide by 16 feet long, which is the length that rough 2x6 normally comes in. You want to start with peas, pole beans, or cucumbers on the backside. They'll climb up your trellis. The second row in, I would go with something like corn and Brussels sprouts planted in the same row. Again, they're not going to compete because they're at different levels. They're going to collaborate. The third row in is do carrots and beets. Fourth is onions and radishes. The beautiful thing about this system is that by the time you harvest your beets and radishes, it'll allow for your carrots and onions to get bigger. So your succession planting, even though you're planting it all at the same time, you're harvesting it at certain crops easier to make room for more. And then in the fifth row, right against the edge, the front side, I like to have a mix of lettuce and herbs. So it's really easy for me to harvest and do kind of relay planting with that. So I've always got fresh gardens year round. And this tiny little, 30-inch wide by 16-foot long bed, this is essentially my fridge for the summertime. That's where I get all my fresh veg from, right outside my back door. So when you're thinking about building your adaptive homestead, you want to add those key functions on your homestead to that list of elements in the needs and yields analysis that you were doing in Rule 1. And then ask yourself, does every element on your homestead serve multiple functions? And is every essential function on your homestead provided by multiple elements? So you've got this adaptive, redundant system. This is a rendering of what the front of my house is going to look like in the future. And even with my food forest, which will be full grown in a few years, it'll be managed so that I'm still getting dappled sunlight to these raised beds. And this is all about this is Leon C. Megginson quoting or summarizing Darwin's theory of evolution, where he said, "It is not the strongest nor the most intelligent species that survives, but the one that is most adaptable to change." All right, rule number 3 out of the 5 rules is all about optimization. And the goal here is we want to find ways that we can create energy flows inside and outside the system that are iteratively optimized. And the key word here is iteratively. So optimization is all about the process of making something as fully perfect, functional, or effective as possible. And this is a process. It's not a destination. I was born and raised on that 250-acre farm. I'm still making tweaks on that design, and on my new property, it's constantly evolving. It's a ton of fun. So there's 2 other exercises that will really help you to optimize the energy flows on your homestead. The first one is sectors, and the second one is zones. So when you think about a sector map, it's where you map out all the outside energy flows that are coming into your property. So the sun, any fire, any floods, any views that you want to accept or block off. If there's an ugly, my neighbor's got a junkyard right next to his across the road from me that I don't want to look at. if there's wind, if there's noise, smells, frost, traffic, wildlife. You want to map out around your property from a bird's eye view, where are all those energies coming from? Your winter sun angle is going to be narrower than your summer sun angle. Map all that stuff out. And the goal there is you want to figure out, okay, am I going to accept these energies, or do I need to place elements strategically to block them? And it's all about energy. How do you optimize energy from outside your system? That's what sectors is all about. Zones, on the other hand, that's all about how do you optimize energy, your energy from within the system. So the idea here is that you create a map of basically the frequency of use on your homestead, where the idea here is the things that you need the most often, or that they need you put those closest to you. Again, it's not a complex concept, but very few homesteads actually practice this, and it changes everything. And so when you start to organize elements on your homestead in relation to how much you need them or they need you, things get a lot more optimized. And generally there's about 5 zones. You can think about zone 1. This is things you use hourly, so multiple times a day. Zone 2 is these are things that you're using once a day. Zone 3 is once a week. 4 is once a month. And 5 is maybe once a year. And again, this is all about how do you optimize your own energy within your system. So to put those two things together, there's something else that I like to focus a lot on my homestead designs, and that's your chore path. So this is whatever walking path that you spend a lot of time on back and forth. For me, I've got livestock, chickens and dairy cows and pigs and beef cows. And so we find that we're going back and forth on this route a lot. If you don't have animals, it might be the path that you walk back and forth to your garage to get to your vehicle to go to work. It might be the path you walk to take your kids to school, or anything else. So it doesn't, if you don't have animals, or if you got something different, but it's the most walked path on your property. And this might change seasonally. You might go from, in the wintertime, you might have a different path where you're going to your woodshed a lot, or your animals are in a different location in the wintertime. So you might need to think about how do you optimize for 2 different chore paths. But for me, the path that I walk is basically I used to walk when I still lived on this farm was, from the house here down this road, where I would do my chores. And I've got a great video. It's my most popular video on my YouTube channel. It's called How I Raise My Milk-Fed Pork, where it follows me along that chore path, where I milk, a couple dairy cows, feed 30 pigs, do my egg chores in under an hour. So even though my chores were very efficient once I get down there, this chore path is not. And it's a major mistake that I made on our first homestead design. And that's largely to the fact that, most of these elements were designed in place before I'd ever heard about permaculture. So we just kind of had to retrofit things to make it work. Because I didn't discover it till 2012, and I was born and raised here. So this is my chore path that I've got mapped out on Google Earth Pro, which is a free program. I encourage you to download it and do this exercise for yourself. And my chore path, one direction is 180 meters, about the same amount in yards. So if you were to figure that out, the average walking speed is 2 meters per second or 2 yards per second. So this walking path there and back takes me 6 minutes, because I'm doing it twice per day. I go down in the morning for my morning chores and down in the evening for my evening chores. That's 37 hours a year. And that's just me. My parents also walk that multiple times a day. So us just walking down there and back is literally costing us thousands of dollars a year in terms of what our hourly time is worth. So I encourage you to do this exercise for yourself and figure out, how much time are you wasting just going from A to B. Now you can see here on our previous homestead, you can see our gardens are nice and close around the house, but they're far away from this chore path. So what I've done on my new homestead is I purposely designed it so that my chore path is not only a lot shorter, this one's only 60 meters, so it's a third the distance, but rather than me just walking aimlessly down, a gravel road, I'm going to walk out my back door, past that cold frame, past the greenhouse, past my kitchen garden, through a food forest to get to my chore hub where I can feed my pigs, milk my dairy cows, look after my chickens in the wintertime. And I call this the grocery store aisle model, because you're essentially, your chore path now is you're walking through grocery store aisles of food, whether it's your garden, your greenhouse, your raised beds, your cold frames, your food forest. And just like in a grocery store, where you got to walk through all the veggies and fruit to get to the meat and the dairy and the all the good stuff and the eggs, the back of the store, it's the same idea. The other beautiful thing about this is, while most people, me as well, you don't want to live right next to a livestock corral, but by using an element like a food forest and placing it in between there, I'm blocking any view or smell or sounds, so that conceptually it feels like it's far away, but spatially it's very close. Here's some other examples from other clients that we've done designs, and you can see these principles that are always the same. Out your back door, which is usually like a mud room where you've got like a summer kitchen type thing, past your kitchen garden, through a food forest. I like to lay it out so that you could potentially take a different path each day through your food forest, out to your chore hub. Here's another client that we did a design for. Again, out the back door, on your way to your greenhouse or your chore hub. You can go up into your kitchen garden. Maybe you walk through your greenhouse or back through your greenhouse, and you could take a different walk down a different food forest every day, so that you could actually plant each row of food forest to have be harvested seasonally. It makes management really easy, because now, rather than just walking aimlessly, you're actually just looking left or right and saying, okay, what's in season? What needs to be weeded? What needs to be watered? Here's another client from Florida, same idea. Their chore path to get out to their livestock area is they can take actually multiple pathways to get there. But each way they're walking through this just abundance of grocery store aisles of food. So when you're building your optimized homestead, you want to think about mapping out your sectors and zones, and then think, is your garden as easy to access as your fridge? Or as Bill Malson liked to say, if you have to get your slippers wet in the morning to harvest your breakfast, your garden's too far away. Figure out how many hours per day you spend, or hours per year you spend, just walking on your daily chore path. What's that costing you at your hourly rate? What other elements could you place along that chore path so you could stack functions in there? And is your homestead optimized for wind, sun, fire, frost, all those energy flows that are coming outside? So again, you're thinking about my energy going out into the system and the energies from outside coming back in, and how do we iteratively optimize that? And again, you're not going to get this right. You're going to make mistakes. But I'm constantly tweaking things, but it's just so much fun. Now, another quote from David Holmgren. He said, traditional agriculture was labor intensive, industrial agriculture is energy intensive, and permaculture design systems are information and design intensive. So in a permaculture system, like Jeff Lawton, another permaculture legend, used to say, you're more likely to do 100 hours of thinking and 1 hour of work, instead of 1 hour of thinking and 100 hours of work. All right, on to the fourth rule. This is all about how do we create anti-fragile systems. And the goal here is the problem is always the solution. This is probably my favorite rule in permaculture, is the problem is always the solution. So when we're creating anti-fragile systems, this is the ability to improve due to stress, volatility, mistakes, etc. So one of the guys who really popularized this term, his name was Nassim Taleb. He wrote a book by the same name, and he said anti-fragility is beyond resilience or robustness. The resilient resists shock and stays the same. The anti-fragile gets better. It wants to be disturbed. So examples of this is weightlifting. You go to the gym to purposefully damage your muscles so that they adapt and get stronger. Rotational grazing is the same thing. You purposefully use your animals to intensively impact the landscape. You give it a lot of rest, and the grass gets better. It produces more. There's more nutrient density. It builds soil. Compost piles are the same thing. You need to stir them up to create stress so that you actually build more biology. So living systems, nature is very anti-fragile. So we've already talked about an example of this previously in rule number 1, which is my kitchen garden, where I'm purposefully putting, a living mulch pathway right next to my garden beds so that I can disturb them, cut them for mulch, and apply that mulch around my vegetables. And you can see here, this is, a couple weeks later. So even in the first year, I was able to get 3 cuts of mulch out of these living mulch pathways. So not only is that, actually I'm taking minerals from one place and nutrients and putting it on my garden bed. So it's actually applying fertilizer, but it's also mulch. So it's minimizing the amount of water I need. But in addition to that, whenever you cut a plant, whether it's a grass or a tree or anything else, it will produce rejuvenation hormones. In addition to the, any of the sloughing off, like the mechanical things that it does, it actually releases growth hormones to help itself grow faster. And those hormones can influence plants surrounding them. So this is why I designed these garden beds out this way, is that I want to be able to go in, harvest that mulch, create a disturbance so that I get these growth boosts from these systems. So this is why, if you don't cut your grass, it turns brown. It stops photosynthesizing. But if you keep cutting it, it stays nice and green. So it's the same concept, and just designing that into your kitchen garden or your main crop garden. You could also do this in your raised beds as well. I've got a lot of other videos on my YouTube channel where I've used different systems. If you're nervous about using perennial pathways, there's other ways you can do it with annual cover crops. But the principle is the same. You want to use this anti-fragile nature of ecosystems so that you can build in the ability for these systems to get better from stress. Again, here you can see, first year, this is that kitchen garden that used to be a gravel pathway or gravel road for parking vehicles. Here's a corn stalk with 3 cobs on it, which is the max ears you can get. So very great production. You can see a watermelon growing in the understory there, all the mulch, the soil covered. Very good system. And again, getting very good yields, even though this is a first year garden. And by the way, I didn't apply any fertilizer to this garden. Or compost the first year. It was other than that cover crop the previous year. It was irrigated though. We do, because we're so dry, we do have to irrigate. Okay. So there's one more story I want to tell. And we might run a bit long, but I think it's worth it. So this is another example of the problem is always the solution. So this is where I used to grow my market garden, right behind my livestock hub here. And again, this is another great placement. You don't want to put your garden this far away from your house. Maybe if it's a market garden and this is your job, but that's way too far away. It was one of the mistakes I made on my first property. But this is how I used to grow out there. So I used to do a lot of garlic, hardneck garlic for my markets. These are 100-foot rows, 1,000 heads of garlic per bed. I would rototill them, plant the garlic in the fall, mulch them heavily. The garlic would come up really nicely through that mulch. I would weed once and only once. Then in August, I would harvest the garlic, and I would put my chickens right out into the garden. This is where you can see where the beds were before. And of course, they would do what chickens do. They fertilize, they weed, they eat pests. They break down the mulch so that it helps to decompose faster. Then I'd actually put my pigs into that same garden right after the chickens got pulled out. This is after 5 days with 5 sows and 12 weaner pigs. And they ate every blade of quackgrass that was in there. In this garden, I never irrigated, I never fertilized, I didn't use any compost, there was minimal weeding, and I had excellent yield. This is a single hill of potatoes that yielded 45 spuds. The problem is that even though I had a lot of those integrations out there, there was still a lot of drudgery. So one of the ways that I used to mulch those garlic beds is I'd have to lay out these straw bales, bust open the straw, spread it out by hand. It would take about an hour to do 100-foot bed. And it wasn't that bad, but the worst of it was that the chickens who were right next door would come flying over my fence around my garden because they love scratching straw so much. And so the whole time I'm out there, I'm fighting these chickens off, chasing them around, trying to get them out. And, that's where I remembered, okay, the problem is the solution, or my motto is drudgery is punishment for stupidity. So what I realized is that, okay, chickens love to spread straw. That's one of their yields. Here's an example. Cut a straw bale open, and within a few minutes, they've spread that 50-pound bale of straw all over the place, right? So I was actually using this in my integrated livestock system to help me spread straw and eat, keep pests down for my dairy cows and pigs. So the idea was, okay, how can I turn this problem into the solution? So I'm not fighting the chickens anymore. I'm utilizing them. So here's a different year. This is my previous crop. I pull that crop out, harvest it, put my chickens in. I rototill, plant my garlic. And this year, instead of me fighting with the chickens and spreading the straw myself, I just let them have at it. And they spread the straw for me. And this was a few days later. They did a fantastic job. They ate any weed seeds that were in the straw and fertilized, de-weeded, everything. So when you're trying to build your anti-fragile homestead, you want to think, what is the biggest problem you face on your homestead and how could you turn it into a solution? And then also, how do you use stress, volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and destruction to your advantage? Or as Nassim Taleb likes to say, the wind extinguishes a candle and energizes fire. Likewise, with randomness, uncertainty, and chaos, you want to be the fire and wish for the wind. All right, now the fifth and final rule. This is a quick one. The rule is the system and its elements must function ethically. And ethical is to do what's right. Now, from a permaculture perspective, there are three ethics: people care, earth care, future care, or as I like to say, mutual consent for all creatures for all time. Now, the story here I want to share is not directly related to gardens, but I think you'll see from the principles here how it can be applied to anything. So the way that I used to milk my dairy cows on our farm is we had something called the hub and spoke model. So the dairy cows can go and graze out on any pasture. They can go to these trees here. They can go across this dam, graze out here, but they're always coming back to this hub for management. And my pigs graze with them. And then overnight, I lock the calves up in a little shed so that they can be separated from their mothers. So their mothers produce milk overnight. And then I milk first thing in the morning. I used to use a simple stanchion like this. Again, my pigs, chickens, cows, they're all related there for those synergistic relationships. And then after I'm done milking, the dairy cows, the pigs, and their calves, they go out in the field, they spend all day together, and they come back, and the cycle repeats again. Now, the problem is with this system is that a couple years ago, I was finding that I was getting mastitis a lot. Mastitis is a bacterial infection, or that's what it's said to be, is a bacterial infection in the mammary glands, which causes a lot of pain and discomfort for the cows and can actually stop them from producing milk forevermore. And so what I realized is that through a lot of different trial and error and realizing that it wasn't, my dairy cows couldn't be getting mastitis because of a deficiency of antibiotics. There must be some kind of an imbalance in my ecosystem that was causing this problem, and I needed to find it. And so I tried to look for these like mechanical things. Was it because the pens were dirty? Was it because I wasn't cleaning their teats off? Was it the lack of nutrition? I went through all these different things. I couldn't figure it out. And eventually I noticed a pattern, which was my dairy cows only got mastitis when they were on this particular pasture. And the reason is that when they were on this pasture, I was forced to make a change in my management, which I just didn't think about, which is that instead of locking the calves up in this little building here, I would, and the reason for that is we used to store all of our equipment right along this pathway here. And so I couldn't have a laneway to allow my dairy cows to go back and touch noses with their calves at night because I didn't want to have a gate here to constantly open and close when we're going to get machinery. So instead, I made a little catch pen at this gate here. And every night I would just leave the calves in this pen. I'd put a halter on the dairy cows. I'd lead the dairy cows back. They would spend the night in this hub. I'd feed them some hay in there. The next morning I'd milk and lead them back. I thought it was a simple system that saved me from having to open a gate. The problem is that all night, the mamas and the babies would walk back and forth and they would be crying out to each other. And at the time, I just thought, you know what, they're just overreacting. They're fine. They can see each other. It's no big deal. But the reason is that they were getting mastitis because they were stressed. Because even though they could see each other, they couldn't physically touch noses and the mothers were worried about their babies. And so even though they were getting all their physical needs, it wasn't an ethical system. They were unhappy. And as a result, it was creating drudgery and pollution. So what I did was I redesigned the whole system. I took out that shed. I built a new milking shed and an overnight pen right beside where I milk. And now the calves get locked up right next to where the mothers are going to be milking in the morning. and they can literally lick their babies while they're being milked. Everybody's super calm, everybody's super happy, and I have not had mastitis once in 5 years from building the system. Here's a design here. There's lots of resources. I've got YouTube videos on this. You can find resources for these designs on our website. So when you're thinking about building your ethical homestead, you want to ask yourself, would I willingly change places with any of the elements on your homestead? Right? Are they actually that happy that if you had to draw straws, you might not want to be a dairy cow, but if you had to, would you draw straws to change places? Or are they actually not happy and you'd be nervous about what if the roles were reversed? And then you think about, what is one action you could do to take more responsibility for your own existence in a joyful way? Permaculture is all about taking on responsibility. Our current system is all about, how do I take a pill? How do I make a phone call to somebody else to make this problem go away? Versus when you start to realize that, man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand within it. And whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. So suffering is feedback for bad design, whether it's your suffering or the suffering of any of your plants or animals or anything else. So the pests, the diseases, any of these things, they're actually a good thing, right? The problem is always the solution. And when we create these ethical systems like that, where we actually would willingly exchange places with all these elements, they tend to be very, very healthy designs. So to wrap this all up and put it all together, there's only 6 words you need to remember to apply permaculture on your own homestead or in your garden: biomimicry, synergy, adaptive, optimization, anti-fragile, and ethical. If you can remember these 6 words, you can apply permaculture in your home garden.